The next example is 29.5, number 6, metastatic carcinoma of the brain and the lung. And using what we learned from our coding handbook, page 451, we know that there's no determination in this documentation as to which is the primary site. So in this case, we're going to use that C80.1 code to indicate that we don't know which one is primary. But we're going to name the lung cancer as the primary because of that table that's in your coding handbook on page 451. It says, when the morphology type is not stated or the only code that can be obtained is C80.0 or C80.1, code as a primary malignant neoplasm, whatever you're looking at, whatever site, unless the site is one of those listed on 451. And the brain as a site of cancer is on that list on page 451. Therefore, the brain cancer is going to be coded as secondary. In this example, I don't believe it matters which code goes first because the information we've been given doesn't tell us which one is the focus of treatment. So I think it's such a general statement, and honestly, in the real world, I don't think you would see this statement very often. I think the point the author is making is just trying to get you to use the coding handbook and recognize that there is consensus across the coding industry that certain sites are not coded as primary unless they aren't on that list, kind of exclusatory list. Okay, let's go to the next one. This is just where I show you from the table of neoplasm. In our previous slide, we showed the brain as the malignant secondary using that second column. The lung is our primary using that first column. It all relates back to that table on page 451 in your coding handbook for why we allowed the lung to be the primary and the brain to be the secondary. Back to this though, because we didn't know, we had to use this C80.1 code in addition to the other two codes. And this is 29.8, number 15. Patient admitted for chemotherapy following an ovarectomy on the previous admission for carcinoma of the left ovary. If you don't remember your medical terms, ectomy usually means cutting out. So an ovarectomy would be the removal of the ovary. So she's had the removal of the ovary, and she's there for chemo. So our principal diagnosis is going to be the encounter for the chemotherapy. And that is found in the alphabetical index under encounter with the subterm chemotherapy for neoplasm. We also have to code her cancer, and that is ovarian, and it's primary malignant. I'll let you look that up for yourself in the table of neoplasms. And be mindful of a couple of things here. There is a guideline very specific to an encounter solely for chemo, immunotherapy, or radiation therapy. And it tells us that if the patient is being admitted solely for administration of one of those things, we are going to assign the appropriate Z code, which we just looked up, Z5111, as our principal diagnosis. There are guidelines, different guidelines, whether the patient is getting chemo, immunotherapy, or radiation therapy. And to also be aware of this guideline, current malignancy versus a personal history of malignancy, we're going to use this primary malignancy code, her ovarian cancer, until her treatment is completed. Once that chemo or radiation or whatever treatment is completed, then she would get that history of personal malignancy code. But until she gets all this treatment out of the way, you're going to code that cancer as an additional code with the principal diagnosis being the encounter for chemo. Here's another example, not in your coding handbook. I wanted to give you some examples of cases that would use more of the guidelines. This particular exercise, the patient is a 46-year-old female admitted for treatment of right kidney cancer. The kidney was transplanted to this patient last year. What guideline comes to mind? If you've been listening over the last several lectures, You should read your guidelines first, then attempt to do your exercises, then read your guidelines again, always relating those guidelines back to what you've read in those exercises. And this is a guideline I did not see in the coding handbook that I think you should always be aware of. There's enough people getting transplants now that this could easily come up when you're in the field. A malignant neoplasm of a transplanted organ should be coded as a transplant complication. The guideline tells us we're going to use a code from category T86, which is complication of transplanted organs and tissues, as our principal, followed by C80.2, malignant neoplasm associated with a transplanted organ, and then an additional code assigned for the specific malignancy. So the guideline has already given us two codes that we know we have to use, the T86 category and the C80.2 code, and tells us we need to look up that whatever malignancy she has. She has kidney cancer. We look up under our table of neoplasms, malignant primary column. It's the kidney with a C64-, meaning we're going to have additional characters to identify her as having the right kidney. The right is character 1 in this code, so the final code is C64.1. So just a good example of knowing that it's not always about organs that you were born with. Sometimes it's about organs that you received. To show you the pathway, in the case of a transplant, you're going to start with complication as your main term, then transplant, then kidney, specified type NEC. That's a T86.19 code. And there are instructional notes that go along with this category. So the first thing I want to do is go into the alphabetical index and briefly look at this complication transplant to show you how we look at this. Okay, we're in complication. Okay, we're in complication. I'm going to go down to transplant. There's transplant. I'm looking for kidney. Here's kidney. T86.10, failure, infection, rejection, and specified type. I think because we're talking about the malignancy, we would use the specified type. It's not one of these things, but our documentation did address a specified type, so I think the correct code is T86.19. Let's look it up in our tabular. And here we are, T86.1, complications of kidney transplant, unspecified, rejection, failure, infection, other complication. I'm going to say it's this one, the cancer. Because it's not unspecified, we know it's a cancer. So we would use T86.19 as our code for the malignancy malignancy of a transplanted kidney. One point I wanted to make was to look at the instructional notes with this category. And this is why you often want to go not just straight to the code, but go back to the beginning of this section. This is called a category code when you have 3 characters. See how it's not complete. You've got this little fourth out here telling you you need at least a minimum of 4 characters for this to be a complete code. But in this category, you're going to use additional codes to identify other complications, such as a graft versus host disease, a malignancy associated with the organ transplant, which is the case that we're working on, and use C80.2. So not only do our guidelines tell us to use C80.2, but this instructional note also tells us to use C80.2. So you're always going to be reading above whatever code you're looking at, reading above to the category to see if there's any instructional notes that apply to your case.